My phone started vibrating at 8:57 p.m., just seconds after my daughter stepped away from the microphone. The screen lit up in my hand, bright against the dark velvet of the auditorium. Mom. For 6 years, that name had been silent. She hadn't called when my husband was lying in a hospital bed with wires taped across his chest and a surgeon waiting on a $30,000 deposit. She hadn't called when I stood in a parking garage begging for help that never came. She hadn't called when Daniel's heart stopped before the surgery was ever scheduled. She hadn't called when Ava and I packed our lives into cardboard boxes because we couldn't afford rent. But tonight, after the cameras flashed, after 800 people stood applauding my 16-year-old daughter for winning a $3 million National Technology Innovation Award, my mother remembered she had a phone. Across the auditorium, beneath the university crest glowing in gold light, I saw my father sitting in the VIP section. Edward Donovan, Ph.D. His face had gone pale. My mother's fingers were clenched around the printed ceremony program so tightly it had begun to crumple. They had just realized what Open Ledger had revealed, and they knew exactly who built it. The applause was still echoing off the high ceilings of Northbridge University's historic hall. Faculty members were on their feet. Donors were smiling. Reporters were already typing. Ava stood at the side of the stage, calm as always, her expression steady, her movements measured. She had never loved crowds, but she understood systems. And tonight, the system was finally listening. The giant screen behind her still displayed the final slide from her presentation. Open Ledger, a blockchain transparency platform for academic funding. Below it, a visual map of funding flows, lines and nodes forming patterns that were impossible to ignore. No accusations, no inflammatory language, just data, public records, mathematical relationships, potential conflict zones. The slide had read. That phrase alone had caused the shift in the room. The applause had started as polite appreciation for a brilliant teenager. It had turned into something heavier when people understood what the diagram represented. Clusters of grant money looping between oversight committees and private advisory boards. Departments reviewing funding applications that were indirectly connected to their own consulting networks. One cluster highlighted in a subtle amber glow overlapped with my father's department. Another intersected with advisory networks tied to my sister Lisa's political tech startup. Open Ledger didn't accuse anyone. It revealed patterns. And patterns make powerful people nervous. My phone vibrated again in my hand. I silenced it without answering. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in 6 years. I wasn't going to start tonight, in the middle of her panic. Ava stepped down from the stage and walked toward us. Michael stood immediately, clapping above his head, pride written all over his face. Eleanor's eyes were already shining with tears. They were the ones who had watched her code until 2 a.m. They were the ones who had learned how to recognize the signs of sensory overload and dimmed the lights before she ever had to ask. They were the ones who had given up their bedroom in a 900-square-foot house when Ava and I had nowhere else to go. Not the people sitting in the VIP section. I glanced back at my father. He was leaning toward a colleague, whispering something urgently. His posture was rigid, controlled, but I could see it in his jaw. He understood exactly what those diagrams implied. Northbridge University was his institution. Reputation mattered here. Optics mattered. Endowments mattered. Transparency was applauded in theory, not when it landed on your own desk. 6 years earlier, I had been the one making calls. I had stepped into a hospital parking garage with freezing concrete under my shoes and dialed my father's number because the cardiologist had just told me Daniel needed surgery immediately. Severe cardiomyopathy, risk of sudden arrest. Deposit required $30,000 before they would schedule the operating room. Insurance would reimburse most of it eventually. But not before. I didn't ask for vacations. I didn't ask for luxuries. I asked to save my husband's life. My father had answered on the third ring. "Send me the details," he'd said, voice calm, detached. I had felt hope then, brief and fragile. The next morning I woke up to an email. Subject line: financial request. It was 312 words long. Flawless grammar, structured like an academic argument. He expressed sympathy for our circumstances. He explained that he and my mother had already allocated significant financial resources to Lisa's startup venture, which was in what he called a critical expansion phase. He described my request as a financial stress test for a young household. He suggested that difficult moments build resilience. He wrote that redistributing committed funds would compromise long-term strategic commitments. There was no phone call. No, "I'm sorry." No, "How is Daniel?" At the bottom, the email ended with Edward Donovan, Ph.D. My mother was CCD. She added nothing. Daniel died 3 months later. The surgery was delayed twice while we tried to assemble funds from credit cards, small loans, anything we could patch together. He went into cardiac arrest in our living room before the hospital ever scheduled the procedure. That night, I called my parents again. It went to voicemail. 6 years passed. No birthday calls for Ava. No check-ins. No quiet apology. Just silence. And now, after my daughter stood on a stage and calmly explained how transparency strengthens institutions, my phone buzzed like a desperate reminder that blood ties only matter when power shifts. Ava reached our row and sat beside me. She slipped her earbuds back into her pocket. "Did they understand it?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I said. Across the room, my father stood up. He began walking toward me through the crowd. My phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't my mother. It was him. I watched his name flash across the screen. Edward Donovan. For 6 years, I had nothing they wanted. Tonight, I had leverage. I let it ring. 6 years earlier, I was the one standing in a hospital parking garage with my phone shaking in my hand. The concrete beneath my feet was cold, and the fluorescent lights above the entrance flickered in a way that made everything feel unreal. Daniel was upstairs in the cardiac unit, hooked up to monitors that beeped in steady, unforgiving rhythms. The cardiologist had just finished explaining the words severe cardiomyopathy and urgent surgical intervention. Then she had said the number. $30,000. "Insurance will reimburse most of it," she told me gently. "But the surgical team requires the deposit before we can schedule." Before we can schedule. As if Daniel's heart were a conference room that needed booking. I nodded like I understood how that made sense. I walked out of the unit before I let myself fall apart. I couldn't cry in front of him. He was already apologizing for being sick. "I should have taken better care of myself," he'd whispered. I kissed his forehead and told him to stop talking like that. In the parking garage, I called my father. He answered on the third ring. "Dad," I said, and the word felt fragile. "Daniel needs emergency heart surgery. We need help. We need $30,000 to schedule it." There was a pause. I could hear the faint hum of his office air conditioner through the phone. "Send me the details," he replied. That was it. No warmth, no panic, just instruction. I held on to that instruction like a promise. I went back upstairs and told Daniel my parents were reviewing the information. I said it confidently, as if reviewing automatically meant helping. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an email notification at 6:12 a.m. Subject line: financial request. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. It was structured like one of his published papers. Introduction, rationale, conclusion. He expressed sympathy for our unfortunate medical circumstances. He explained that he and my mother had already committed significant financial resources to Lisa's technology startup, which was entering what he described as a critical funding phase. He used the phrase resource allocation twice, He described my request as a financial stress test for a young household navigating responsibility. He suggested that difficult moments were often formative in developing resilience. He did not mention Daniel's name again after the first sentence. He did not ask how Ava was coping. He did not say, "I'm sorry." The email ended with, "Edward Donovan, Ph.D." My mother was CC'd beneath it. She had added nothing. I remember staring at that signature longer than anything else. Not dad, not love, just credentials. Daniel's surgery was postponed while we scrambled. I applied for emergency medical credit. I maxed out 2 credit cards. I called Daniel's insurance provider 3 times in one day and listened to hold music that felt cruelly cheerful. The hospital tentatively reserved a date, then delayed it again pending payment confirmation. Daniel grew weaker. He still tried to joke with Ava when she visited. He told her her coding skills were going to change the world someday. At night, when it was just the 2 of us, he would look at me with that quiet worry he thought he was hiding. "I don't want you drowning in debt because of me," he said once. "You're not a debt," I snapped, sharper than I meant to. Then I softened. "You're my husband." While I was arguing with billing departments, Lisa posted photos from a funding announcement event for her startup. She stood in front of a branded backdrop at my father's university, smiling beside 2 board members. Caption: "Grateful for visionary leadership and strategic investment." I stared at that word. Investment. $30,000 would have scheduled Daniel's surgery. 3 months after the diagnosis, before a confirmed surgical date was locked in, Daniel collapsed in our living room. Cardiac arrest. Ava was in the kitchen when it happened. The paramedics arrived fast. Not fast enough. I remember the silence afterward more than anything else. The house felt hollow, as if sound itself had left with him. That night I called my parents again. It went to voicemail. The funeral was small because Daniel had never been one for spectacle. Ava didn't cry the way other kids did. She organized the printed programs by font size on the dining table. 2 weeks later, I sat at our kitchen counter with a calculator and a stack of unpaid bills. The rent was due in 3 weeks. My hours at the bookstore had been reduced. The hospital invoices were arriving in thick white envelopes that felt heavier every time I picked them up. I opened my laptop and drafted another email. Subject: temporary housing request. I kept it simple. Daniel is gone. Ava and I need stability. Can we stay with you for 6 months while I regroup? I stared at the send button for a full minute before clicking it. Their response arrived within 4 hours. My father wrote that they were in a particularly demanding phase of their academic careers. Hosting us, he said, would create disruption to their professional environment. He suggested that grieving privately in familiar surroundings might be healthier for Ava. He ended with the same signature: Edward Donovan, Ph.D. Again, my mother was CC'd. Again, she added nothing. That was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. I stopped expecting them to show up. Ava came into the kitchen and saw the open email on my screen. "Are we moving?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She nodded once, then asked the question that sliced deeper than any academic paragraph ever could. "If Grandpa had the money, why didn't he help Dad?" I looked at my daughter, 15 years old, autistic, brilliant, logical to the core. I didn't know how to translate resource allocation into something that didn't sound like cruelty. "He made a choice," I said finally. Ava considered that carefully. "So we'll make different ones," she replied. That night, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't my parents. It was Michael Bennett, and the first thing he said was, "When can we come get you?" Michael didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask how much debt we were carrying or whether we had a plan. He just said, "When can we come get you?" 2 hours later, His old pickup truck pulled into our apartment complex parking lot. Eleanor stepped out with a thermos of coffee and a box of plastic storage bins. "We'll make it work," she said, like that was the only detail that mattered. Their house was 900 square feet in a quiet Milwaukee suburb. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a narrow hallway that creaked when you walked too fast. The kitchen table sat directly under a window that looked out onto a maple tree that had seen better decades. In the back of the house was Michael's workshop, no more than a converted shed with shelves lined with clocks and watch parts. The steady ticking created a constant background rhythm. When we carried our boxes inside, Eleanor walked straight into the larger bedroom and began stripping the bed. "You and Ava take this one," she said. "We can't," I started. "You can," she replied gently. "You're not guests." Michael moved their clothes into the smaller back room without another word. There was no ceremony, no speech about sacrifice, just space made where there hadn't been enough before. That first night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I had grown up in a Boston townhouse with framed diplomas in every hallway and shelves filled with awards for public service and academic excellence. This house had none of that. It had ticking clocks and chipped paint and a refrigerator that hummed a little too loudly. It felt more stable than anything I'd known in months. Ava struggled the first week. The ticking in the workshop overwhelmed her. She covered her ears and paced when the rhythms layered over each other. Michael noticed without her having to explain. The next morning, half the clocks were gone from the walls. "Inventory rotation," he said casually when I looked at him. Eleanor watched Ava's routines the way a scientist observes patterns, quietly, without judgment. She learned that Ava preferred her food separated, that she needed warning before lights were turned off, that sudden touch felt like electricity. She never once asked if Ava would grow out of it. She never once asked what was wrong. At dinner, she simply placed a plate in front of Ava at the exact same time every evening. Predictability settled into the house like a second layer of insulation. I took 2 part-time jobs, the bookstore during the day, administrative data entry in the evenings. I recalculated hospital debt until the numbers blurred together. One afternoon, I found a paid utility bill on the counter that I knew I hadn't covered. "Michael," I said quietly. He waved me off. It was late. I handled it. Their income came from a public school teacher pension and whatever Michael earned repairing watches. It wasn't much. It was certainly less than my parents' annual research stipends. They never mentioned money again. Ava began spending more time in the workshop, sitting at a small folding table Michael set up beside his repair bench. She watched him log every transaction by hand in thick, lined ledgers. "Why do you write it down?" she asked him one evening. "So I can see where things go," he replied. She studied the pages closely. Names, dates, amounts, clear columns. That night, she asked me a question that made my chest tighten. "Why do universities receive political funding?" I blinked. "What?" She was sitting cross-legged on the bedroom floor, laptop open, screens filled with public grant databases. "I'm mapping advisory boards," she explained calmly. "Some names repeat." She showed me a spreadsheet labeled Pattern 1. It listed committees from Northbridge University, donor entities, research labs, and something else. Lisa's startup advisory connections. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. "Ava," I said carefully, "this isn't about your grandparents." She didn't look up. "It's about systems. If a system is ethical, it shouldn't collapse under transparency." Michael overheard us and leaned against the doorframe. "If you're going to build something," he said, "build it right." Within weeks, he had scavenged spare computer parts from a school district surplus sale, old processors, extra RAM, a slightly dented tower casing. He assembled them on the workshop table like a puzzle. "For your experiments," he told Ava. She renamed her spreadsheet Open Ledger. She began constructing something more than a spreadsheet, an early blockchain model that could trace public funding from donor to department to external partnership. Late one night, she called me into the room. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and the soft clack of keys under her fingers. On her screen, colored lines connected boxes labeled with university departments and advisory boards. "Look," she said. One cluster looped from a research oversight committee back to a consulting network associated with Lisa's startup. The lines formed a closed circle. "It's not proof," she said. "It's an anomaly." I stared at the diagram. My father chaired that oversight committee. "Ava," I whispered, "if this is wrong, it could hurt people." "If it's right," she replied, "it could help them." There was no anger in her voice. No revenge, just logic. I thought about the email signed Edward Donovan, Ph.D. I thought about the hospital corridor. I thought about $30,000. For months after Daniel died, I had felt like everything was happening to us. Bills, refusals, silence. Now, for the first time, it felt like we were building something instead of surviving something. The house might have been 900 square feet, but inside those walls, patterns were forming. Not just in Ava's code, in us. I tucked her in that night the way I had when she was small, though she no longer liked being touched for long. "Mom," she said softly, eyes still on the ceiling. "If money leaves one place and ends up somewhere else, the chain should show it." "Yes," I said. "And if it doesn't, that's a problem." I watched her drift toward sleep, her breathing evening out. In the next room, I could hear Michael winding a clock and Eleanor rinsing dishes. My parents had degrees in ethics and public policy, but the people teaching my daughter integrity lived in a house small enough that we had to pass sideways in the hallway. For the first time since Daniel's heart stopped, I didn't feel powerless. I felt like we were building something that didn't need their approval to exist. When the world shut down in March of 2020, our house grew quieter than it had ever been. Schools closed, offices emptied, universities announced remote transitions with carefully worded emails about public safety and continuity of excellence. For most families, the pandemic brought chaos. For Ava, it brought order. "No fluorescent hallways," she said the first week classes went online. "No cafeteria noise." She sat at the folding table in Michael's workshop, headphones on, fingers moving across the keyboard with steady precision. The outside world felt unpredictable and loud. Inside our 900-square-foot house, there were routines. Breakfast at 7, work at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. Michael adjusted the clocks so they ticked softer now, fewer layered rhythms overlapping. Eleanor learned to knock twice before entering any room. Ava coded for 8 hours some days, 10 on others. Open Ledger evolved from a spreadsheet into something structured. Blocks linked in chains, timestamps embedded into transactions, public datasets feeding into an interface that flagged anomalies automatically. She studied federal grant databases and university transparency portals the way other teenagers studied social media. Michael upgraded her cooling system using salvaged fans from discarded desktops. "Can't have it overheating," he muttered, tightening a screw with gentle concentration. Eleanor set a timer on her stove so Ava wouldn't forget to eat. While the country argued about lockdowns and mask mandates, my daughter mapped funding flows between advisory boards and research labs. Lisa appeared in online conferences that spring, smiling into polished webcams from her apartment in Boston. Her startup had pivoted toward political data modeling for virtual campaign environments. "Ethical data democratization," she said during one panel I watched late at night. Behind her, I recognized the Northbridge University crest mounted on a bookshelf. My father moderated the Q&A. They discussed transparency as an abstract virtue. I watched my daughter code a system that measured it. One evening, Ava called me over. "I expanded the dataset," she said calmly. Colored nodes filled her screen. Lines connected committees to labs, labs to advisory groups back to consulting firms. "This cluster repeats," she pointed. "It's statistically improbable." The highlighted cluster intersected with Northbridge's Funding Oversight Committee, my father's committee. It also intersected with Lisa's startup advisory network. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. "Ava," I said carefully, "we need to make sure this is accurate." She nodded. "That's why it's blockchain, public records only, no private data." 2 days later, an email arrived through the generic contact form she had attached to OpenLedger's beta site. "You're misunderstanding how institutional funding works. Stop analyzing what you don't understand." The tone was polite, dismissive. Ava tilted her head when she read it. "They didn't deny the pattern," she observed. "Who is they?" I asked. "Someone who saw it." She traced the IP routing. It bounced through multiple servers. "Masked?" she said. "But university linked." The next message came 48 hours later. "Academic ecosystems require discretion." The language felt eerily familiar, measured, professional, almost paternal. I heard my father's voice in the phrasing. "Do you want to stop?" I asked her that night. She looked at me with mild confusion. "Why?" "Because this could get complicated." She thought about that. "If a system depends on secrecy to function, it's already compromised," she replied. Michael was sanding a wooden clock casing nearby. He didn't look up. "Truth isn't revenge," he said quietly. "It's documentation." The pandemic cut my bookstore hours in half. The administrative job reduced pay during remote operations. I recalculated expenses late at night while Ava's server hummed in the next room. Cloud storage wasn't cheap. Neither were expanded processing cycles. One afternoon, I found a small receipt tucked into a drawer in Michael's workshop. He had sold a vintage pocket watch from his personal collection. When I confronted him, he shrugged. "It was sitting there," he said. "Better it sits in a server than a box." I swallowed hard. OpenLedger's first large-scale simulation ran in early autumn. Ava scaled the dataset to include 3 public universities beyond Northbridge. The patterns were not isolated. Funding loops appeared in different configurations across institutions, but the strongest anomaly cluster remained at Northbridge. "It scales," Ava said quietly. The words sounded bigger than our small house. Late one night, she ran a visualization that rendered funding flows in 3-dimensional space. The loops glowed in amber against a dark background. "It's not illegal," she said. "It's structural vulnerability." I stared at the screen. "If this becomes public," I said slowly, "it could hurt people's reputations." "If it stays hidden," she replied, "it hurts trust." Outside, the maple tree rattled against the siding in the wind. The world felt unstable, like everything could shift without warning. Inside, my daughter was building something precise. The next anonymous message arrived a week later. "Withdraw while you still can." This one had no polite framing. Ava didn't flinch. "They're escalating," she said. "Are you afraid?" I asked. She paused, genuinely considering it. "No," she answered. "But they are." By winter, OpenLedger was no longer a project on a folding table. It was a functioning prototype capable of mapping funding structures in real time using publicly available data. Universities across the country were struggling financially during the pandemic. Transparency was a buzzword in press releases. None of them expected it to be quantified by a 16-year-old girl in a house small enough that the hallway required single-file walking. One night, as snow gathered on the roof, Ava printed out a diagram from her simulation. The funding cluster at Northbridge formed a closed loop that fed back into itself. "It's self-reinforcing," she explained, "like a system protecting itself." I thought about the email signed Edward Donovan, Ph.D. I thought about the $30,000 that had been described as a financial stress test. In the quiet of that house, with clocks ticking softly and servers humming, I realized something had changed. We were no longer reacting. We were building leverage. And somewhere in Boston, in an office lined with framed diplomas, people who had never worried about our survival had no idea a storm was forming out of pure mathematics. The email from the National Youth Innovation Council arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam. Ava didn't. "It's legitimate," she said, after checking the domain registry and authentication headers in under 30 seconds. The subject line read, "Finalist, National Technology Innovation Award." She had submitted OpenLedger months earlier at Michael's quiet insistence. He had filled out the recommendation form himself, hands slightly shaking as he typed. "This isn't about attention," he had told her. "It's about impact." The email invited her to present the platform before a selection committee in Chicago. Travel stipend included. Live demonstration required. I read the location twice before it registered fully. Northbridge University would host the final award ceremony that autumn. The irony didn't escape me. Ava didn't react emotionally. She simply opened her project file and began preparing a clean version of the code for demonstration. "If they ask about ethical implications, I'll show the transparency threshold model," she said. "You're assuming they'll ask difficult questions," I replied. "They should," she said calmly. We drove to Chicago in Michael's truck because Ava preferred predictable motion over air travel. Eleanor packed food containers labeled by day and time. She slipped a small handwritten note into Ava's backpack. "You belong in every room you enter." The presentation room in Chicago was sleek and modern. Glass walls, branded banners, judges seated behind long tables with tablets and styluses. Ava stood in front of a projection screen, twice her height. She didn't pace. She didn't stumble. She walked them through the architecture of OpenLedger, block structure, timestamp verification, anomaly detection algorithms. Then she showed the visualization. Clusters bloomed on the screen like constellations. One judge leaned forward. "Have you tested this against real institutions?" "Yes," Ava answered. "Public datasets only." "Did you notify them?" "Transparency platforms do not require permission to observe public information." The room went quiet for a fraction of a second. I felt a strange mix of fear and pride twist in my chest. Afterward, in the hallway, a man in a tailored suit approached us. "Impressive work," he said, extending a card. "I advise several higher education boards. Transparency is complicated." The pause after complicated lingered. "We're careful," I said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you are." Back in Milwaukee, the anonymous emails intensified. "You are misrepresenting governance structures. You lack context." One message included a link to an article criticizing amateur data activism. Ava didn't respond to any of them. She added additional verification layers instead. Michael installed a small firewall device between her server and the modem. "Just in case," he muttered. 2 weeks later, the official announcement was released. OpenLedger had won. $3 million in grant funding for further development and pilot implementation across select universities. The award ceremony would take place in October at Northbridge University. I stared at the press release on my laptop screen. Northbridge, my father's institution, the place where he chaired oversight committees and lectured about public ethics. The funding for the award came partially from a federal transparency initiative. Lisa's startup was listed as one of the event's technology sponsors. The symmetry was almost surgical. My phone rang that evening. Boston area code. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text appeared from an unknown number. We should talk before this becomes public. I showed it to Ava. She studied the number for a moment. It's routed through a forwarding service, she said. But the originating provider is Massachusetts. Do you want to withdraw? I asked again. She looked at me like I had asked if she wanted to stop breathing. No. Northbridge began advertising the ceremony across its academic networks. Innovation, integrity, the future of ethical technology. My father's name appeared in the list of honored faculty attendees. My mother's department would host a pre-event reception. Lisa was scheduled to speak on a panel about digital governance. The invitations arrived in Boston gold. I held ours in my hands for a long time. 6 years earlier, I had asked to stay in their house for 6 months. Now, their institution was inviting us onto its main stage. Michael pressed his lips together when he read the program. They won't like what this shows, he said. It doesn't accuse anyone, I replied. It doesn't have to. Eleanor placed her hand over mine. Whatever happens, she said, you walk in with your head high. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Open Ledger underwent its final beta expansion. Ava integrated real-time anomaly flagging and a public dashboard that allowed users to view funding flows without accessing raw code. It's not about destroying institutions, she said. It's about strengthening them. The night before we left for Boston, she sat on the edge of her bed, laptop closed for once. Mom, she said quietly, if they apologize, what will you do? The question hung in the air heavier than any algorithm. I don't know, I admitted. She nodded once. Open Ledger doesn't punish, she said. It reveals. The auditorium at Northbridge seated nearly 1,000 people. We arrived early to avoid crowds. Michael wore his only suit. Eleanor wore a navy dress she had altered herself. I could see the VIP section from our assigned seats in the 3rd row. My parents were already there. My father's posture was upright, composed, as if this were any other academic ceremony. Lisa laughed beside him, polished and confident. Ava stood backstage preparing to present the final demonstration. When her name was announced, the applause began politely. Then the screen behind her lit up with the full Northbridge dataset simulation. Amber clusters formed. Funding loops appeared. No accusations, just patterns. I watched my father's face from across the room as the diagram rotated slowly under stage lights. For the first time in my life, he didn't look composed. He looked uncertain, and I realized that 6 years earlier, when he described my request as a financial stress test, he had never imagined the test would return to him. Only this time, the numbers were public. The applause inside Northbridge's main hall did not sound like celebration. It sounded like tension breaking. Ava stood beneath the stage lights, steady and composed, as the final Open Ledger visualization rotated slowly behind her. The amber clusters were subtle, almost elegant, but anyone who understood institutional structures could see what they represented. She did not name names. She did not accuse. She simply concluded, "Transparency strengthens systems that are already ethical. It exposes pressure points in systems that are not." Then she stepped back. For half a second, the hall was silent. Then the applause began. It built quickly, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Faculty members rose from their seats. Journalists lifted cameras. The panel of judges exchanged glances that felt heavier than approval. I did not look at the screen again. I looked at the VIP section. My father's hands were clasped together, fingers pressed tightly. His jaw was rigid. My mother stared at the rotating diagram as if it might dissolve if she blinked. Lisa's smile had disappeared. The Master of Ceremonies returned to the podium. "Open Ledger represents the future of ethical technology in academic funding," he announced. We are proud to award this year's $3 million National Technology Innovation Grant to Ava Bennett. $3 million. The number seemed unreal. Michael exhaled beside me like he had been holding his breath for minutes. Eleanor's hand found mine and squeezed hard. Ava accepted the award plaque with both hands. No flourish, no theatrics. When they offered her the microphone for a short acceptance statement, she kept it simple. "Technology has value when it protects truth," she said. "And truth protects families." She did not look toward the VIP section. Instead, she turned slightly and found Michael and Eleanor in the crowd. "I dedicate this award," she continued, "to the two people who gave us a home when we had nowhere to go." The camera operator instinctively followed her gaze. The massive screens on either side of the stage zoomed in on Michael and Eleanor. Michael blinked in surprise. Eleanor covered her mouth with her hand. The applause shifted. It grew warmer, more personal. Across the hall, my father's face drained of color. My phone vibrated in my purse. "Mom." I didn't answer. Ava stepped off the stage, grant confirmation documents tucked under her arm. Reporters surged forward, asking questions about blockchain architecture and pilot implementation phases. Northbridge's president shook her hand stiffly. "We look forward to partnering with you," he said carefully. Ava tilted her head slightly. "Open ledger is public," she replied. "Partnership requires transparency." The word landed in the space between them like a weight. In the VIP section, I saw my father stand abruptly. He leaned toward one of the university trustees, speaking in low, urgent tones. Lisa checked her phone repeatedly, her expression tightening with each glance. The live-streamed ceremony had already been clipped and shared online. OpenLedger's Northbridge cluster was circulating on social media before the reception even began. A reporter approached me near the aisle. "You're Ava's mother?" "Yes." "What inspired this project?" I thought of hospital corridors, of unpaid bills, of a 300-word email signed with credentials instead of love. "She believes systems should withstand scrutiny," I said. The reception hall buzzed with low, anxious energy. Donors clustered near the bar. Faculty members spoke in hushed tones. Michael and Eleanor were surrounded by strangers congratulating them. "Your granddaughter is remarkable," someone said. "Your support must have meant everything." Michael nodded politely. "We just gave her space," he replied. My phone vibrated again. "Dad, for 6 years there had been nothing. No birthdays, no holidays. Now, in the span of 10 minutes, both of them wanted my attention. I stepped away from the crowd and answered. "Yes." "Claire." My father's voice came through, controlled but strained. "We need to discuss this." "This?" I repeated. "This presentation, the data interpretation. It's public information," I said evenly. "You're oversimplifying complex institutional ecosystems." A familiar phrase. "Are we?" I asked. There was a pause. "You've made this personal." "No," I said quietly. "We didn't." Behind me, I could hear the rising hum of media questions. He lowered his voice. "We are proud of Ava. Of course we are. But this could have serious reputational consequences." I looked through the glass wall toward the main hall where Ava was explaining anomaly thresholds to a group of tech journalists. "For whom?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. "We should meet privately," he said. "We tried that 6 years ago." The line went silent. Across the room, my mother was approaching. Her steps were slower than I remembered. "Claire?" she said when she reached me, voice trembling slightly. "We didn't know Ava was working on something like this." "She was," I replied. "You should have told us." I stared at her. "We did tell you when we needed something." Her mouth opened, then closed. "I'm sorry about Daniel," she said suddenly, as if the words had been waiting behind her teeth for years. The apology felt delayed, fragile. "I asked you for $30,000, I said evenly. Not sympathy. Her hand tightened around her purse. "We were in a critical phase," she began. I almost laughed. That phrase sounds familiar. Across the hall, a trustee was speaking sharply to Lisa. Phones were lighting up everywhere. Open Ledger's Northbridge visualization had triggered something larger than any of us had anticipated. A university spokesperson was already drafting a statement about commitment to internal review and transparency standards. The storm had started. My father joined us, face pale. "You've embarrassed us," he said, low and controlled. I met his eyes. "You embarrassed yourselves." He flinched, barely perceptible. "This isn't revenge," I continued. "It's mathematics." For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Ava appeared at my side. "Mom," she said calmly, "the Federal Transparency Office wants to schedule a pilot meeting next week." She looked at my parents, studying them the way she studied data. "Hello," she said politely. My father swallowed. "Congratulations," he managed. "Thank you," Ava replied. "Open Ledger is open source. You can review it anytime." She turned away before they could respond. The applause from the ceremony still echoed faintly in the hallway, but it was no longer celebration. It was consequence. And for the first time since that email signed Edward Donovan, Ph.D., I understood something clearly. Power shifts quietly at first, then all at once. The fallout began before we even left Boston. By the time we reached our hotel that night, Northbridge University had released a statement announcing an independent review of its research funding oversight procedures. The wording was careful, measured, forward-looking. It did not mention Open Ledger by name. It did not have to. Lisa's panel appearance the next morning was quietly removed from the program schedule. Her startup's logo disappeared from the digital sponsor reel within 24 hours. Michael read the headlines on his phone in the hotel lobby. "Patterns raise questions at Northbridge." One article read, "Teen developer sparks transparency debate," another said. Ava did not read any of them. She sat at the small desk in our room, already reviewing documentation requests from federal transparency auditors. "It's not about them," she said, when I asked if she wanted to look at the news. "It's about the data." Back in Milwaukee, life returned to something resembling routine, except it wasn't quiet anymore. Journalists called, advocacy groups emailed, university administrators from other states requested pilot access to Open Ledger. Ava insisted on one condition for every conversation. "All datasets must be public," she said. "No private back-channel access." Michael installed a more robust security system in the workshop. Eleanor began answering phone calls with calm, firm politeness. "We're proud of her," she said, over and over. The $3 million grant funds were dispersed in phases. After legal structuring and compliance setup, the first installment landed in Ava's designated development account. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the number on the banking screen. For 6 years, I had tracked every $100 payment toward Daniel's remaining hospital balance. Now there was room to breathe. The first thing I did was log into the hospital portal. Outstanding balance, $8,247. I paid it in full. The confirmation receipt arrived in my inbox 30 seconds later. I stared at it for a long time. Daniel's surgery had never happened. The debt had lingered like a shadow. Now it was gone. The second thing I did was ask Michael for a copy of the deed to the house. He hesitated. "Why?" he asked. "Because I need to see something." That's when I found out about the home equity loan. $23,000 taken out the year we moved in. Property taxes, roof repairs, unexpected furnace replacement. They had never mentioned it. I drove to the bank the next morning and paid it off in one transfer. When the confirmation letter arrived, Michael held it in both hands like it might vanish. "You didn't have to," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. "I did." We found the new house 3 weeks later, still in Milwaukee, still close enough that the maple tree-lined street felt familiar, but larger. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a detached garage that could be converted into a proper lab space for Ava. Michael walked through it slowly, touching door frames, inspecting hinges. "It's too much," he murmured. "It's enough," I corrected gently. The offer was accepted within 48 hours. When we handed them the keys at closing, Eleanor cried openly. "We gave you a room," she whispered. "You gave us stability," I answered. The workshop clocks moved with us. So did the folding table where Open Ledger had been born. Ava designed her new lab with quiet precision: soundproofing panels, temperature-controlled servers, ergonomic lighting. "It needs to be functional," she said. The second phase of grant funding allowed us to establish something larger, the Bennett Transparency Foundation, named for Michael and Eleanor. Mission: to support neurodivergent students pursuing ethical technology and STEM innovation. 20 annual scholarships, open-source mentorship, no legacy donor plaques, no marble hallways, just access. When the foundation paperwork finalized, I handed Michael the documents listing him as chair. He read his name twice. "A public school teacher," he said softly. "A grandfather who showed up," I replied. The press coverage around Northbridge intensified. Independent auditors uncovered procedural overlaps between advisory committees and consulting entities. No criminal charges, but policies shifted, committees restructured, disclosure requirements tightened. My father resigned from one oversight position quietly, citing focus on academic writing. Lisa's startup issued a statement about voluntary transparency alignment initiatives. No one said the word conflict of interest publicly. They didn't need to. 2 weeks after the ceremony, a handwritten envelope arrived at our new house. Boston postmark. No return address. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. "Claire, we understand if you cannot forgive us. We were wrong about Daniel. Wrong about you. Wrong about Ava. We were afraid of disrupting our lives and called it responsibility. We see now what that cost. We are proud of Ava. We are proud of the mother you became. We do not expect anything in return. Mom and Dad. No credentials, no PhD. Just Mom and Dad." I sat at the new kitchen island and read it twice. Ava came in, saw the envelope, and waited. "Is it them?" she asked. "Yes. Are you angry?" I considered that carefully. "No," I said. "I'm finished trying to earn them." She nodded once. "Open Ledger doesn't punish," she said again. "It reveals." That night, I tucked the letter into a drawer. Not burned, not displayed, just stored. Outside, the maple tree in our new yard moved gently in the wind. Inside, the servers in Ava's lab hummed with steady purpose. 6 years earlier, I had believed I lost my parents when they refused $30,000. Now I understood something different. I didn't lose them. I stopped needing them. And in the space that created, we built something stronger. The first Christmas in the new house felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. The ceilings were higher. The rooms echoed slightly when we laughed. The lab in the converted garage glowed softly through the window, servers blinking in quiet rhythm. Ava adjusted the thermostat in her workspace before dinner, making sure the temperature remained stable for the equipment. She treated that room like something sacred. Michael stood in the kitchen carving ham while Eleanor rearranged dishes for the 3rd time, insisting the table needed to look balanced. I watched them move through the house that now belonged to them outright. No hidden loans, no quiet sacrifices they thought I wouldn't notice. The Bennett Transparency Foundation website had launched the week before. Applications were already coming in from students across the country, Kids who described sensory overload in classrooms, who saw patterns others missed, who wanted to build ethical systems instead of exploit them. Ava read through a few submissions earlier that day. "They think like me," she said softly. "They just don't have support." "You do," I reminded her. She glanced toward the kitchen. "Yes," she said. We set the table for 7, Michael and Eleanor, Ava and me, 2 foundation board volunteers, and Mrs. Ramirez from next door, who had started dropping off tamales the week we moved in. Not a single seat felt forced. Halfway through dinner, my phone buzzed. Boston area code. I turned it face down without looking. Eleanor noticed. "You don't have to answer," she said gently. "I know." After dessert, Ava disappeared into the lab for a moment. When she returned, she carried 3 small framed prints. She handed one to Michael, one to Eleanor, one to me. They weren't paintings. They were simplified open ledger visualizations. Michael's print showed a clean chain of transparent transactions labeled Trust Built. Eleanor's showed multiple support nodes feeding into a single central point labeled Stability. Mine showed branching paths that converged into one steady line labeled Choice. "These are your patterns," Ava said simply. Michael swallowed hard. "I don't need a graph to know I love you," he said, voice rough. Ava nodded. "This is how I say it." Later that night, after everyone left and the house fell quiet, I stood in the doorway of her lab. She was staring at a new dataset projection. "Mom," she said, without turning, "Northbridge implemented the disclosure reform." I stepped closer. On the screen, the funding loop that once glowed amber now appeared broken, redirected through a compliance channel. "Is that good?" I asked. "It's better," she replied. A few days earlier, another letter had arrived from Boston. This one, longer, more detailed. My father wrote about stepping back from committee leadership, about reconsidering how he defined responsibility. He did not defend the email he had sent 6 years ago. He did not justify the decision. He wrote, "We thought success meant protecting our reputations. We see now it should have meant protecting our family." I read it once. Then I closed the envelope. I no longer needed him to understand me. I had already built something that did not depend on his approval. New Year's Eve arrived quietly. No galas, no academic receptions. Just us in the living room with sparkling cider and a countdown on the television. At midnight, Ava looked at me and said, "Family is a system too." "How so?" I asked. "If one part fails, the others can compensate, but only if they choose to." She wasn't angry when she said it. She was analytical, honest. I thought about the hospital corridor, the $30,000, the email signed Edward Donovan, Ph.D. I thought about the 900-square-foot house and the clocks ticking softly in the dark. I thought about the night at Northbridge when my parents turned pale under stage lights as their daughter and granddaughter rewrote the narrative without ever raising their voices. Revenge had never been shouting. It had been building something stronger. In early spring, the first Bennett Transparency Foundation scholarship recipient visited the house. A 17-year-old girl with noise-canceling headphones and a notebook filled with circuitry sketches. Michael showed her the workshop. Eleanor offered tea. Ava walked her through server architecture. The girl's eyes lit up. "This is possible?" she asked. "Yes," Ava said. It was. One afternoon, months later, I received a final voicemail from my mother. "We're here," she said. "If you ever want to talk." There was no urgency this time, no panic, just space. I didn't call back that day, or the next. Maybe someday I will, but forgiveness doesn't require proximity, and peace doesn't require reconciliation. I stood on the front porch that evening, watching Ava through the lab window as she adjusted a line of code. The sky above Milwaukee was clear. For 6 years, I believed I had been abandoned. Now I understood something different. I wasn't abandoned. I was redirected. Blood doesn't define family. Showing up does. Staying does. Building something when everything collapses does. If you've ever had someone refuse to stand beside you when you needed them most, I want you to remember this. You are not powerless. Sometimes the quietest response becomes the strongest one. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments about the person who showed up for you when others didn't. And if you believe in stories about resilience, justice, and family that's chosen instead of inherited, stay here with me. There's more to tell.